Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is March 29th, 2012, and my guest is Richard Burkhauser of Cornell University. Rich, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Our topic for today is the economic status of the middle class. We hear a lot of talk about the middle class is disappearing. My colleague Tyler Cowen talks about the great stagnation. There's a view that the rich are getting richer. Everyone else is either treading water or falling behind, so inequality is growing. And, of course, there are statistics to back these claims up. The median wage rate has grown very little, if at all, since the 1970s, and there does appear to be growing inequality. But it turns out a lot of these data are subject to interpretation, and decisions have to be made by researchers on what they mean. And what we're going to talk about today is a paper that you've done with Jeff Larimore and Casali Simon from the March issue of the National Tax Journal, which is called, your article is called A Second Opinion on the Economic Health of the American Middle Class. And what you show is, depending on how you define income in the unit of analysis, you can get a very different take on what is happening. So start off by telling us what you did and how you came to the project.
Sure. Well, I've been looking at issues of income and poverty for the last 30 years, really. And my efforts in this regard actually go back to at least 10 years ago when people were looking at what was happening in the 1980s. And that's when this issue first began of the disappearing middle class. That is, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, and the middle disappearing. And just using conventional methods in those days, using what the Census Bureau uses to measure income, that is income from the current population survey, pre-tax, post-transfer income. That is the income that people report when the Census Bureau guy knocks on your door and you say, you know, how much are your earnings? What did you get in interest and dividends? Those sorts of things. When you simply did that and looked at the distribution of household income of individuals and arrayed them from no income to the person with the highest income, you'd get a distribution. And we did something just very simple. We looked at this distribution, you know, and it's kind of a bell curve. That is, there's two tails and a bunch of people in the middle, a little hump there. And we did it for 1979, which was the start of the 1980s business cycle. And we did it for 1990, which was the end of the business cycle. And we just put those two distributions on top of each other. And we found this really kind of interesting thing. It was absolutely true that when you put the 1989 distribution on top of the 1979 distribution, the middle shrank. It disappeared. But where did all those people go? Well, they disproportionately became richer. So we actually could see that you ended up with a very small part of the tail that got poorer, about 10%, and of the mass that you pushed down from the middle moved to the left and became a little poorer, but 90% became richer. So this whole business that was talked about the middle disappearing, if you think about it simply as the middle mass, where most of the people are, it is true that middle disappeared, but most of it disappeared by people getting richer. So I've always been suspect of people who make these claims just using the simple statistics that the government provides us.
Now, let me just clarify that. So, obviously, if somebody asks you what you earn or what your income is, what your salary is, most people have in mind, as you said before, their pre-tax income. They don't think about what their after-tax income is. If they were asked, they might be able to get close to that. Most of us have some idea of what we pay in taxes, or I would argue that it's probably pretty imprecise except around the month of April. But when we look at government data on income, we're typically looking at the pre-tax income to start with. And what you're talking about, this change over that decade of 79 to 89, you're talking about when you include non-earnings, right? You're adding in interest income, you're adding in government transfers. Is that what you're talking about, or are you just looking at pre-tax income?
No, I'm absolutely talking about that. That's right. This all gets very interesting when we decide, well, what is it that we're going to count? So historically, well, what I should say is that empirical economists are really limited in what they can say by the data that they get. So a major scientific innovation beginning in the 1960s was that in 1967, for the first time, the Census Bureau became willing to go out and poll people in their homes, and we started to have an annual current population survey. In that survey, which is now the most important data set used to measure the income and employment of Americans, the surveyor goes into the door. They ask the principal person in the household to describe all of the sources of income of that person and all the other people who live in that household. And that is both market income, that is, returns to land, labor, and capital, and any transfers from the government. So that's the technical term for that is pre-tax, post-transfer, in cash income.
So it does not include in-kind benefits. It would not include food stamps. It would not include my vacation. It would not include my health insurance.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. And also any subsidies you get for housing or many other in-kind
non-cash.
the government
non-cash.
provides. That's right. Exactly.
Okay. So starting in 67, the CPS, the Current Population Survey, gets that information. And so if I'm trying to figure out what's happening, I just want to make one other key point here, which is that in these debates, people often focus on the median, which has a very good thing about it, which is it's not sensitive to outliers. So if the overall population is getting a lot, if national income's growing, but it's growing because a few people at the very right-hand tail are gathering all the goodies, which is what some people think, then the average could go up, but the average person wouldn't be getting any of it. So to avoid that problem of the right-hand tail and distorting what's happening to the typical American, people use the median. Now, the median has its own problems, which we'll come back to later, but its best advantage is it avoids this problem of outliers to the right or to the left, somewhat to the left, because zeros are obviously a little bit weird, but put that aside. So the advantage of median is it isn't distorted by outliers. But one of the problems is what you count still is difficult to decide, or sometimes you might have an axe to grind. So if you want to make the growth in median income look small, you leave out in-kind benefits and cash benefits outside of income because they've got more importance since 1979.
That's right. And it's not only true that they become more important because they become an increasing component of the transfer system of government to low-income people, but even the compensation of workers has increasingly been in non-wage compensation. And the most important one is the employer-provided health insurance.
Sure.
So approximately 75% of all the workers in the United States either have their own employer providing them with compensation in health insurance, or they're the spouse of someone who's working and they're on their plan. So this is a major part of the compensation program, and it's not included in measures of wage earnings or in income.
Let me ask one more clarifying question because you raised it when you're talking about how the survey is administered. So I'm sitting at home, the doorbell rings, it's the Census Bureau, and this is an annual survey. This is not the every 10-year, correct?
That's right. It's done each March, and while the CPS actually has people in it for a period of 16 months, it's only in March that they ask the detailed questions about income, and the other months they ask questions about employment.
So the guy knocks on my door, and the unit of analysis, which we're going to come back to later, in this case with the CPS, the unit of analysis is the household. So if my father lives with me and he receives Social Security, that would be included in post-transfer household income, not obviously pre-transfer. It's not earnings. It would not be, if we're just looking at the income of the household, my father doesn't work. But if he lives in my house and he gets Social Security, that would be included in the survey if I remember to tell him. If I remember to tell the guy, right?
That's correct.
What else would be in that household income that might be a little bit offbeat or a little bit unusual? Because I think it's important for people to remember this is not not a bunch of individuals who get surveyed. It's the household as a group.
Well, that's right. And one of the major issues is there are three kinds of sharing units, we call them, that you can think about. The idea here is that if you're doing a study of wage rates or wage earnings, the natural unit to look at that is the individual. And so we don't worry about where the individual, what the individual does with its earnings. But once you recognize that people share things, and we do it in a natural way, when you're trying to look at people's economic well-being, you actually want to think about what their power is to consume. And what you recognize is, for instance, if you simply looked at the personal income of people who live in households, you'd get very strange results. You'd get that take a dad who works full-time in the marketplace and a mom who works full-time at home raising their children. You'd end up, if you use the individual as the unit of analysis, showing that the husband was making a lot of money and was in perfectly good shape.
The wife would be dirt poor, yeah.
The wife would have no income of her own, and therefore would be counted as being poor, and the children, of course, would be poor. But that's, of course, an odd way to think about things. That in fact we live in sharing units, and we share income. So you want to be sure to get the sharing unit correct. So there are three ways of thinking about that. One is the household. All the people in the household, you assume, share their incomes together. But what we know is that there could be more than one family in a household. And a family is defined as anybody who is your blood relative or who you're married to. And it's possible that that's the sharing unit. And then the third sharing unit is the tax unit. And the tax unit is who you put on your income tax form when you pay your money to the government.
So that would include my daughter, who is in college, who makes some money working part-time. That money by itself would make her look desperately poor, but of course she's not poor because she's still in my tax unit and really still in my household, even though she does not live here.
That's right. The tax unit is in our work, in our most recent work, we really think carefully about which is a more appropriate unit for the sharing unit. Should it be the tax unit or should it be the household? And I think there are two really nice examples of a difference between those two. So the first is two people who share everything except a marriage certificate. And increasingly in the United States, in the generation of people in their 20s and 30s and more, people are testing out relationships before they officially marry.
Right.
And so you can get two people who are not blood relatives and who are not married, who in fact share everything. But if you use the tax unit as the unit of analysis, you're assuming that they don't share anything and they're individual units. If you use the household, you recognize that they're sharing. That's one example. The other is the one that you mentioned, that if your father lives with you and is getting Social Security benefits, he's probably paying, he's a tax unit, a separate tax unit from you and your family.
He's not my dependent.
That's right. He's not your dependent, but he is living in your household, and he's probably sharing things with you. And likewise, your child would, your adult child who started out, got his college degree, but is a so-called boomerang kid and is living in your basement. He maybe works a little bit, but not a whole lot. He would be considered a separate tax unit also.
And of course, one of the issues here, which is you have to deal with, is that the expression is two can live as cheaply as one. It's not quite true, but there were a lot of economies of scale, obviously, within the household, which is why you're talking about the sharing unit. You're sharing the food, you're sharing the responsibilities of upkeep in the house, perhaps. A lot of these things means that this group, looking at people as per capita within this unit isn't quite accurate.
That's right. So the next kind of building block is once you've chosen a sharing unit, then you have to recognize that if you're going to compare sharing units and figuring out how much income they have and which is a better sharing unit, you have to recognize that a sharing unit that's a total of one person and has $50,000 is going to be a lot better off than a sharing unit that has four people and the same $50,000. So what you really want to do is not look at sharing units or tax units, but look at the income of a household, the income available to people who live in a household or in a tax unit. And that says that you take the total income, whatever it is that you've measured in the sharing unit, and you divide by the number of people in that household or tax unit. But as you said, the old saying is two can live as cheaply as one. That's not quite true, or else you would just take that number and multiply or
divide by the number of people in the household. But that's not quite right because two people, two people earning. You said one person earning $50,000. That two people earning 50 and living together have a little more command over goods than that person, even though the average in the house is 50. The two living together are going to have a little advantage in terms of their command over goods and services than the one person living on his own with 50 because of the economies of scale.
That's right. You use the same amount of heat, whether there's one person in the room or four. You can buy the economy size containers of milk and the large portions of meat, which is a little bit cheaper than buying the individual packs. So there are lots of
two-bedroom
house.
Two-bedroom house isn't usually twice as expensive. A one-bedroom house where the two people sleep in the same bedroom is going to be the same price for the two. So that's an even more dramatic example.
Exactly right. So for that reason, the formula people usually use is take the income, divide it by the number of people, and then do it to a power. And if the power is zero, any number to the power of zero is 1, and that means that there's perfect economies of scale. That would mean that, you love me so much that if I eat an apple, you feel satisfied. That's probably a bit much. So we don't want to say that a one-person household needs just as much, or no more than a 10-person household. So if you raise it to the power 1, then of course that's per capita, and you say there's no returns to scale. So what people do in the international literature, and I think this is a reasonable number, is they move it to the power of 0.5. And it turns out if you move it to the power of 0.5, you get a very nice relationship. That is, a family of 4 needs exactly twice as much as a family of 1 to be at the same level of economic well-being.
So let's to get away. The power of 0.5 is just the square root, right? So
that's right. Just take the square root.
So what you're saying is that if I've got 4 people, give me the example again. 4 people who say earn a family of 4, which is let's say it's a traditional nuclear family of a husband, wife, and 2 kids. That family of 4 that let's say earns, we could have many ways that family could earn 100,000. Each parent could be working, earning 50. One parent could be working out there at home, earning 100 for the one who works. But if the total command of goods and services for a family of 4 is 100,000, that's equivalent to what of one person?
50,000.
Okay.
So that's right. So just take that 4, which is the number of people, take the square root of it, which is 2.
Divide that into 100.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's so instead of taking literally per capita income, which would be 25 in the case of that family of 100, you're really saying each family member is like living on 50, even though they don't each get 50,000 of spending money.
That's correct.
Okay, so keep going.
Now, I'll just say that one of the nice things about that is that simple calculation approximates the way that poverty lines are set traditionally in the United States. So that elasticity, which is what we call that power, is very close to the elasticity that you would get if you looked at the poverty line for a one-person family, a two-person family, 3 and 4 in the United States.
So analogously, it doesn't just ramp up multiples of the number of people. It takes into account the fact that larger households can economize and get a larger effective per capita share.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Exactly right.
So the work we described before, so how does this household, if you're using household units as your measure of analysis, how does that play out when you're looking at, say, the growth in income from 79 to 89? So there's two issues here. One is you got to decide what income is, and you're saying if you change from pre-tax to instead pre-tax post-transfer, you get a different answer. How does this household calculation we just went through? Why is that relevant?
Well, once you've done that and you've looked at the simplest, as you said before, the simplest measure of how the typical American is doing is how the median American is doing. But the issue is, how do you determine who the median American is?
How do you line them up?
And yes, that's right. And just sort of an interesting point is that if you ask about what's been happening to the median household, you're going to get a very different answer than if you ask what's been happening to the median person in the United States.
Using household income.
That's right. That's right. It turns out that the median person has higher income than the median household does, which seems like a Lake Wobegon statement that all of our kids are higher than average. But it's perfectly consistent to say that because the majority of people live in households that are above the median. Why is that the case? It's because households with more income also have more people. So this is why these seemingly footnotes really matter. It turns out if you just look at median income last year, median income is about $50,000, but the median person in those households has income of about $60,000.
So I'm confused by that. So let's try to walk through that with maybe a stylized example. Because when you're saying the median person, are you saying using the calculation with the square root that you just talked about? Or are you just taking doing that? You're just taking all earners and lining them up. Is that correct?
All persons.
Right. So
yes.
So explain to me again why in that situation, maybe we could take an example of 3 households. It might be too hard to do, but if I have 3 households where all 6 people are working, or maybe if I have 3, I'm not sure how to construct the example.
I think this is the way to think about it.
Go ahead.
Take those 3 households, right? One household has 20,000 in it. The next one has 40,000 in it, and the next one has 60,000 in it.
Median household income is 40,000.
Yeah, so the median household is 40,000. But it turns out that the first household only has 1 person in it. The second household has 2 people in it, and the third household has 3 people in it.
So the median's in the highest household.
That's right.
Well, but that won't work because the 60,000 has 3 people in it, but they only are earning 20. So they're going to be down with
the household is but the household it's the household income of the median person is $60,000.
Okay, I'm with you there. Now I understand. Great. Correct. You're right. If I went to you and if you're in that large household, I said, "What's your household's income?" You'd say 60.
Exactly.
So if I survey individuals and rank them, I'm going to get a 60.
That's right.
As the median. So I agree with you. So richer families, larger families tend to have more income, regardless of what the source of the causation is. There's a correlation there.
That's right.
Some of it's because they have more people working, but some of it's just for other reasons. And so,
but I think.
Go ahead.
I think the only point is that you have to really think through what it is that you're measuring, why it is that you're measuring it, because all these things that seem to sound the same turn out to lead to quite different measures.
Yeah.
Now, it's not because the assumptions, it's not because there's mathematical errors here. It's that all of these measures of social success can lead to different levels and trends in what's happening in the United States. And it's why, as I started this story out by talking about the 1970s, I talked about the 1970s and 1980s. I am old enough to have lived through the 1980s. And in the 1990s, when people were saying that the rich were getting richer, the poor were getting poorer, and the middle class was shrinking, that just didn't seem right, because I looked at the United States and I thought we were much better off over the 80s than the way these numbers were coming up. And it's what got me first into recognizing how the little details can really matter in terms of the perceptions of what's going on.
Yeah, I have the same issue. It doesn't pass the sniff test with me. Now, of course, it's dangerous to think that way. It could be you swim in the wrong circles or very special circles. And when I look around, and I live in the Washington D.C. area, and the economy looks pretty healthy, that's not a very good indicator of how the economy's doing, because Washington's very distinctive. But when people tell me that we have made no progress on average since 1970, 75, 74, 79. I was alive then. I remember what cars looked like. I remember what stores looked like. And the average person has a much richer material life now than they did 40 years ago. And it's absurd. It seems absurd. Maybe I'm wrong. So it's why you have to look at the data. But as you point out, it's not simple to look at the data. You have to make all kinds of decisions about and assumptions. And your biases and ideology, of course, color what your assumptions are.
I think that's right. And so what I find, so there are two issues. One are the things that you just talked about. And I think that's why it's very important from a political perspective to objectively look at these things. But I'll tell you the truth. The truth is, and this is just the way we academics are, and I admit it, the puzzle to me is, how can you get such apparently wildly different visions with the same data? And to bring us up to the paper that we talked about today, it comes from a quest on our part to figure out how two extraordinarily smart people, Piketty and Sayez, could get such wildly different perspectives on what's happening in the United States using their data than I could using these traditional measures that I've been looking at for the last 30 years. So I was getting some results that were much different from the vision you get looking at Piketty and Sayez. And I knew these guys were really smart. So either there was something wrong with the data that they were using versus the data that we were using, or they were using different assumptions in the way they were measuring this data than we were, or one or the other of us had made mathematical errors. And it took us 4 years to actually figure this out. But the answer is, it wasn't the data, and it wasn't that we were making mathematical errors. It was that we were fundamentally asking different questions, but using almost the same words to describe our findings.
So tell us what you did. You, of course, now we're going to be looking at a longer span of time, 79 to when? We actually with them go back all the way from 1967 to 2007.
And that paper is actually coming out in Review of Economics and Statistics this next issue. But it's also that paper explains why we're doing different things. And then this paper that just came out in National Tax Journal argues that we think our way of thinking about it is better than their way of thinking about it.
So let's do the National Tax Journal paper first, if you think that's appropriate, because
Sure.
you have a nice little table in there that shows dramatically how making slightly different assumptions that seem innocuous or relatively unimportant, like tax unit versus household unit, you get radically different answers for what's happened over the last, in this case, 20 or 30 years.
That's right. So let's take the simplest measure of economic well-being of the typical American, and let's look at what's happened to median income between 1979 and 2007.
So this is pre-tax.
So first of all, this is using the current population survey, which is not what Piketty and Sayers use. They use IRS data, and this is a very important point. I started the conversation by saying that economists are limited by the data that they have available. Our questions really can only be answered in terms of the units that we're talking about beginning in 1967 in a consistent way, because that's when the CPS first started.
Right.
Piketty and Sayers were asking questions about what's been happening to income back through the entire 20th century. And they used as their unit of analysis Internal Revenue Service data on tax units. So they looked at tax units, we looked at households. So what we did, and this is what's kind of cool, is we took their assumptions about sharing unit, that is the tax unit, which you can get in the CPS data. They can't get the household in the IRS data. Because as a tax unit is a subset of a household, we can replicate their assumptions. So we used a tax unit, and that is the units that people include in their tax filing units. We look at pre-tax, pre-transfer income, which is called market income. That's the return to land, labor, and capital.
And that's really all they have as their income measure, because they have tax data.
That's right.
They don't have transfers. They don't have in-kind benefits, compensation that's non-monetary, or even, and of course, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so they're asking a perfectly valid question. They're asking what's been happening to the median market income of tax units. That is, when you add up the returns to land, labor, and capital, what's been happening to median income. They don't adjust for household size or tax unit size. And they, as you said, they don't include government transfers. They're just looking at the returns to land, labor, and capital. And when we use their measure in the CPS data from 79 to 2007, we get a pretty discouraging result. The median income of these tax units has only increased by 3.2% over the entire 30 years.
Which is zero. That's zero. Close to zero.
Yes.
That's not annual. That's not per year. That's over the total. That's flat.
That's stagnation.
Yep.
That's what they call it. The middle class has stagnated over the last 30 years. And that statement is correct. But what does that statement mean, and how do you put it in the context of how a typical American has done over those last 33 years? Is it really true that we haven't increased at all in our ability to consume things in the last 30 years? So now,
or that if we have, it's all gone to the top 5% or 1% or 10th of 1%.
Exactly.
So the pie is clearly bigger. The question is, there's two issues here. One is one's absolute command over goods and services, and then you can discuss also one's relative command in where you are in the distribution, or a group's command, a certain segment of the population, the middle fifth, say, or whatever. But this is just saying that in absolute terms, if you just look at income and capital income,
market income,
earnings plus dividends and capital gains, correct?
Yes.
Then it's flat between 1979 and 2007. There's no 3% total increase. That's corrected for inflation, right?
Yes.
But so once you correct for inflation, no gains to the median household, median tax unit, excuse me.
That's correct. Now, I want to be careful here. The CPS does not collect capital gains. So capital gains are not in here. And actually, in the original paper that Piketty and Sayers did, where all this stuff came from, they also didn't use capital gains in their principal measures.
Okay.
So that's a problem with
But
this.
for the median, it's not that big. It's not that big for the median. It's pretty small. Okay, so carry on. So, but then you made a different assumption and you got a different result.
Okay, so let's and this is the fun part of the puzzle. Let's just no longer take the tax unit as the unit of analysis, but now let's look at the household. And you go from a gain of 3.2% over that period to a gain of 15.2%. And that happens because the number of tax units per household has been rising over that 30-year period. There's a lot more people living together and sharing everything except a marriage certificate.
Fascinating. Okay.
So now let's go to the next level.
But let's stop there for a sec. So that just changing the unit of analysis from tax unit to a household unit, taking account of the fact that there are people who are living together who are called separate for tax purposes, but actually can have some economies of scale, that changes the growth rate by a multiple of almost 5.
It's actually different even than that. We haven't even brought in economies of scale yet. We're just saying, in the sense of dividing.
Oh, just the unit, just the.
It's just the unit. Simply going from a tax unit to a household unit, sharing unit, changes that, because in these tax units, you have people. Their assumptions about tax units are. They care very much about what the top 1% or 5% of tax units are, but they also want to include not only the people who pay taxes, but the people who don't file taxes. So they have to make some assumptions about who's in these tax units. And their assumptions are that anyone over the age of 20 who is not living with, anyone over the age of 20 who is not married is an individual tax unit. So they get a lot more
low
individuals with low numbers than you would when you recognize that most of these people who are above the age of 20 but aren't married are connected in some way with other individuals in households. So you get fewer.
They've got a bigger left-hand tail. They got a lot more units total, since they're below the median, typically they're pulling the median down.
That's correct. Now, I want to be clear on this. They can't do this. That's why they didn't. The advantage of what we can do is we can actually get a median because we know what the distribution is below these top units. They don't know that. They make assumptions about that. So that's why they Piketty and Sayers can't tell you what the median tax units pre-tax, pre-transfer income is. They just don't have that data. We do because we have the CPS and we can put it into smaller tax units. And the important thing about the the Restat paper that we've done that says this is all valid is we can virtually get their results using the CPS. That's what was really cool about that paper.
So, just to make that clear to people who maybe find that confusing, you're using a different data set than they're using, but you can replicate their results because you have a lot of the data that they're effectively using. They have more of it. Yours is just a sample, but it doesn't matter because you can mimic what they've done by taking the same assumptions in your data. So that's a way to check that the sensitivity of the results to the assumptions. If you start with their assumptions, with your data, you get a similar result, even though you're not using the exact same data set.
That's exactly right. And here is the really important intellectual point here. No one has been able to do this before. So people have argued that you can't actually use the CPS to look at the tails of the distribution. And therefore, Piketty and Sayers, even though their data has problems, those problems are less than the problems in the CPS. The thing that took us 4 years to do was to show people, no, that's not true. We can actually get very close to the levels and trends that they get in their IRS data using the CPS data. That's what took a long time. Once that is established, once you grant me that the CPS can get approximately what the IRS is getting, then you can write a National Tax Journal article that can actually show how sensitive the assumptions that they are forced to take because of the limits of their data matter if you go beyond what it is that they're asking.
Okay, so go ahead.
That's what this paper is, I think, interesting about and is so profound. And this table, this one table, as we go through it, is to me so shocking that you can get such dramatically different numbers for a simple concept like median income. So we've gone from tax units where there's an increase between 79 to 2007 of 3.2, simply from going to the tax unit to the household unit, we get 15.2.
So almost a five-fold increase, but still 15.2 over that length of time. It's 28 years. It's not great. It's half a percentage point a year. It's fair. It's pretty good. It's not stagnant, but it's not great.
That's right. Okay, so now when you go to household size adjusted pre-tax post-transfer income, so now we're going to the usual measure that I've been using, the Census Bureau's measure, pre-tax post-transfer income, and the unit is the household, and we're adjusting by the number of people in the household to the 0.5. You go from 15.2 to 23.6. So now, instead of 3.2 for a tax unit pre-tax pre-transfer, you now have 23.6 for the household sharing unit adjusted by the number of people in it, and we're including government transfers.
So is it pre-tax post-transfer? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
It's not post-tax post-transfer.
That's correct. We haven't looked at income taxes and sales taxes yet.
Okay.
Okay, then what we need to recognize is not only does the government transfer income from high-income people to low-income people through government transfers like the Social Security Social Security benefits and disability benefits and TANF benefits and those sorts of things, but it also does it through a progressive income tax. So when we then use the National Bureau of Economic Research's tax simulator with the CPS data, we can simulate the amount of income taxes, state taxes, and payroll taxes that people pay.
Because you know a lot of their characteristics. So you're going to pretend, you're going to try to approximate what their income tax form would be filled out to yield if you could see it. You can't see it, but you know a lot about them. You know how many kids they have. You know what kind of income you don't know everything about them. It's just because you might not know their charitable deductions, all their medical deductions, et cetera. But do you know the value of their house? Do you have their mortgage? You might have that, right?
We don't know about mortgage payments.
Okay, so it's a crude estimate.
On average, we do. But
it's a crude estimate.
Yes, that's right.
And what do you find then?
So then we go from 23.6%, which is the median income without taxes, to 29.3% growth. Now, you might say, how can you get median income growing faster when you're subtracting things out? And the answer is that we've actually been paying, at the median anyway, we've been paying a smaller share of our income into taxes, and that's why you get the growth is 29.3 rather than 23.6.
Okay. And then there's one last change.
Yes, and then the last change is to talk about this growing share of earnings that comes in non-wage compensation, and also the fact that Medicare and Medicaid have been growing also. So we, as an example of how important it is to think about in-kind transfers as well as in-cash transfers, and to think about the value of health insurance for employees as well as their wages, we are able to estimate the employer share of employer-provided health insurance to workers and the insurance value of Medicare and Medicaid to lower income people who are getting those benefits. And when you do that, it goes from 29.3% to 36.7%. So we're really talking about a difference from 3.2 in the way that picking and sayers are thinking about things in tax units to 36.7 if we simply include the value of health insurance as well as do the other things that we've talked about.
It's a tenfold increase. So there's two obvious thoughts here. One is, boy, it sure makes a difference about what you assume. And as you point out, you can there are different justifications for what you might look at. But if you're looking at economic well-being, it's hard to argue that first measure is the right measure. You'd think you'd want to include things like transfers and health insurance. And you've left out a bunch of stuff, by the way. There's at least two things you've left out. One is there's all kinds of other non-monetary compensation that isn't in the CPS that I suspect has been growing. Silly, small things, but not zero. Dental benefits, vacation. I'm not sure it gets bonuses. Does it get non-regular bonuses in the March CPS?
In principle, it does, but how well that does, I don't know.
But they've become more important over the last 30 years in compensation. Yeah. So you have all the point is that one, as you said, it's a beautiful example of how assumptions matter and data analysis. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's kind of amazing that range from 3.2 to 36 point something. But the other, of course, I think what some people would be asking, and I always find this is a question I hear a lot from sometimes from students. So which one's right? Because they can't both be right. One's really big and one's really small. So which one's right? Because they want to write down the exam. When the exam comes and says, how's the median income person doing? Right? You got to put in an answer. And there's A, really well. B, pretty well. C, not so well. D, lousy. What's the right answer, Professor Burkhauser?
Well, I think the right answer depends on what the right question is.
Yeah.
So if you're asking what's been happening to market income, I think there's no question that wage rates have become more unequal. But once you adjust for health insurance and other things, it's less unequal, and that in terms of real compensation, it's clearly rising. So I think that even there, returns to work have been rising. The notion that we as a society are not doing as well as we were 30 years ago, I think by virtually any measure, reasonable measure, is just false. And once and I think that's the main statement. The issue of distribution is a little harder. It's a little harder to argue. We have become somewhat more unequal, but even there, what we find is in the CPS data is between 1992 and 1993, there was a change in the ability of the census to capture exotic incomes of the top 1% of the income distribution. So if people look at the CPS data and don't recognize that in 1993, we suddenly were able to better capture income, they will get the false notion that income inequality increased between 1992 and 1993. It didn't. It just was our ability to capture that income. And we had actually adjust for that here. But what it says is that when you get people telling you things that just don't seem to be consistent with reality, you really do need to look very carefully at the assumptions that they're making.
So what kind of reaction have you gotten from these two papers? Oh, by the way, we haven't talked about the Reviewing Economics and Statistics paper. Give me a punchline on that one.
Sure. Well, the punchline on that one is that when we sent that paper to the AER, we sent a paper to the AER that made the following statement, that income inequality in the United States rose substantially between 1967 and 1992, but hasn't increased very much since 1993. And we did that using the measure I just talked about, household size adjusted pre-tax post-transfer income. And we got back a referee report from the AER that said, this clearly can't be true because Piketty and Sayers have found that income inequality has risen dramatically in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So we had, we were just minding our own business using the traditional measures and hadn't really, to tell you the truth, paid a lot of attention to Piketty and Sayers in that literature. So in order for us to publish clearly what we thought were traditional ways of measuring things, we had to demonstrate to referees that, in fact, you could get those two results. So that's when we looked much more carefully at what Piketty and Sayers did. We then we took and what we had. The other thing that we had, which is really cool, is that the CPS public use data limits what you can know about top income people because it top codes each of the 23 types of income that people get. By top coding, I mean that they want to protect the confidentiality of people, so that if you have a lot of income and a particular source of income, they will not give you.
They truncate it. They truncate it, right? They just call it a million, even though it might be 87 million or whatever is the truncation.
That's right. So good economists, recognizing that, stopped using the CPS to measure inequality because the top parts of the distribution were non-systematically lopped off. Yep. And they started using 90-10 ratios and those sorts of things, looking at the person's the 90th percentile and the 10th percentile. So we actually gained access, and this is kind of a cool story in itself, we actually gained access to the internal CPS data. And we're able to get around these top codes and to see much more clearly what was going on. At least the top codes in the internal data were much more in the range of the top 99.2 or 3 rather than lower down, which is what the other ones were doing. And we observed one important thing. In 1995, 1996, it appears in the public use data that income inequality gigantically increases. Well, it turns out that the only reason it gigantically increased was instead of using top codes starting in 1996 in the public use data, they began using cell means of the top parts of the distribution. That is, rather than lopping things off at $1 million and giving everybody $1 million as the value, they looked at all the values above $1 million, found out what the mean of those values was, and gave you that, say, $2.5 million. So if people naively used the data, the public use data, suddenly they saw all these 2.5 millionaires rather than the 1 millionaires that they 1.0 millionaires they had the previous year. So all these kinds of things.
And it makes it always makes the New York Times, and I always look at those data and I want to say they clearly either change the definition or it's a coding error. The world doesn't change like that in a year, but that never stops them. And I'm being unfair to the New York Times, but I guarantee I'm very confident somebody wrote an embarrassing article assuming those numbers were meaningful.
Absolutely, and you'll still see those pictures in the New York Times and even the Wall Street Journal, surprisingly enough. So anyway, we got around all that. We got the internal data, and that's when we found this kind of important point that while income inequality has increased slightly since 1993, it hasn't increased by all that much. We couldn't get that published because people said that was inconsistent with Piketty and Sayers. Then that led us to see that Piketty and Sayers were really measuring market income, not the total income. They were looking at tax units rather than households. They weren't looking at government transfers. And we were able then to ask the question, what's been happening to the trends in the top 1% of tax units? How much of total tax market income do they hold? What about the 5%? What about the 10%? And we were able to show that for the 90 to 95th percentile, when we use the CPS data, but their definitions, we got their trends dead on for the 90th to 95th percentile. For the 95th to 99th percentile, we got their trends dead on. And it was only in the top 1% that we had some differences. And the two biggest differences, and this is kind of cool, is that in 92, 93, when I told you that they changed the ability of the census to get these exotic numbers, there's a big jump in our data that's clearly an error, not an error, it's a change in methodology in the CPS. We get a big uptick where they're actually getting a downtick. So their numbers are better there, and that's clearly wrong. And that said that we should lift all of our previous years up so that there's no break. But they also have a tick. The Reagan administration worked with the Democrats in Congress in the 1980s to adjust the top taxes, the top personal income taxes. And in the 1986 reforms, for the first time, made the highest personal income tax rate lower than the corporate rate. And when that happened, not surprisingly, there was a dramatic increase in the amount of market income reported on people's taxes. So
they used to take it as distributed profits in partnerships and other businesses,
exactly.
Right? Yeah,
exactly right. So in their data, they have this big uptick in the share held by the top 1%. That in our data, there's no change.
Yeah.
So I would argue that that is the exact same problem. When you adjust for those two sorts of things, then the trends are actually pretty close.
Okay, so then you're able to then look at a different trend when you include I assume you're then going to do something similar to what you did in the National Tax Journal piece.
Well, actually, we didn't even do that. All we did in that was to show that we could get their results.
Oh, okay.
But that's important because it says that it's important for them, it's important for us. We both verified that if you're asking the question that they're asking, they're correct, and we can verify it. And if we're asking the question we're asking, we're correct, and it's not inconsistent with what they're doing. But it goes back to this question. The ultimate question is, what's the question? To me, here's how Piketty and Saez can really be misused. There's a book out that uses the Piketty and Saez numbers, and it's by a political scientist, and he's arguing that we're back to the Gilded Era in the United States.
I've seen that book.
That the share of income held by the top 1% is as great today as it was in the 1920s. Well, that is true of market income, but let's think about the 1920s and think about today. In the 1920s, there was no Social Security system. If you weren't earning market income, you were in bad shape. We do now have a Social Security system, and all the people over the age of 65 who have no market income are not starving in the streets. But that market income, that transfer income, is not included in that comparison. So, to make comparisons of what's been going on with market income and imply something about the economic well-being of people in the United States is to completely misuse Piketty and Saez's numbers.
I just want to mention to listeners that Piketty and Saez's work, we'll put links up to it, and they make their data available online. If you're interested in playing with it, you can see it. They're very transparent about their data. You can create your own spreadsheet or cut the numbers a little differently than they've done it. But as you point out, they're asking a different question or but I think the real issue is that people, they don't care what question they're asking. They're going to take their answer and they're going to use it to answer their own question, which is how are people doing? How's the country doing? I think to give them the benefit of the doubt, and as my listeners know, I'm very skeptical about these theories that the average person is doing poorly. So I'm very amenable to your kind of improvement, or what I would call an improvement. But let me play devil's advocate for a minute. If you look at say men's income or men's wages, it is remarkably flat. Now you have to be careful because I'm talking about individual workers now.
Yes.
One of the mistakes that people make, and it's a very subtle point, is that if you're taking an increasing share of your income in the form of healthcare, in the form of healthcare insurance from your employer, the CPI that you're using then to deflate your market earnings is misleading, because that CPI has been going up somewhat dramatically, partly because healthcare costs are going up. But if you have healthcare insurance, you're insulated from that somewhat. You're just taking your income in that form of the insurance, but you can't then use the entire CPI to deflate your market income. It's not the correct measure, because you don't have to use that market income to buy health insurance, to buy healthcare. So that's a subtle point. I don't know if people are listening can grasp it, but maybe I spoke too quickly there. But the point is that on the surface, the stagnation of market income is not encouraging. It's not that comforting to be told, oh, well, don't worry, you're getting it in the form of healthcare insurance. Yeah, but what I have left over isn't changing much. Well, part of what you have left over is actually a little bigger than it appears, because of the way the CPI is calculated and this fact that you're getting this in-kind transfer. But it's still, it's not the cheeriest. It's not the cheeriest conclusion to say, well, the middle class is doing better because if you include transfers, it turns out it's pretty good. That is slightly alarming.
Well, I think that I think the more important point is that what is driving these kinds of changes, and what can you do about it? I think that's where all of this goes to. These are social success indicators that hopefully give us some idea of what's happening. So I think that what's happening is that the returns in the marketplace are now more unequal, that there is a great premium on education and training, that and you want to ask yourself, why is that happening? The sort of simple-minded answer to that, which some people would argue, is it's because the greedy top 1% are getting all this in profits and exploiting the working man. I just think it's a much more complex issue than that, and that we need to get beyond that and think about what's actually happening here. And what I think most economists are arguing is that we're having technological change, which is skill biased, and if you have skills, you actually are doing pretty well. The return on education has been rising, even though the number of people going to school and getting higher educations has been rising. But if you don't have skills today, you're really competing with the unskilled labor of around the world. And what are we going to do about that? Well, again, it depends on how you think markets work. I think markets are like mirrors. They show you, in fact, the way the real world is working. And you can either deny that, or you can adjust your practices so that you are able to do better in that world. So what it says is that if we're going to be in a world of competition, a world in which we allow the free movement of goods across borders and we have international trade, that means that we have to be skillful. And if we're workers, we have to invest in education, and we have to recognize that if we don't do that, our returns are not going to be that great. So my view is for people who don't have those skills, have low incomes, who are poor, I'm absolutely in favor of transferring income to those folks. But I want to do it in a way that doesn't kill the golden goose that allows us to be productive, and that is by allowing people to get a fair return on their investments. So this class warfare discussion that seems to come from this rather arcane discussion that we're having, I think is very serious. And what I'm suggesting is that the numbers that I'm showing is that yes, things are more unequal in the marketplace, but they've been offset substantially by 50 or 60 years of government programs that have worried about redistribution, but worried about it with the recognition that you you can't do simple things like simply raise the marginal tax rates on the top 1% and not expect that to have some impact on productivity and growth.
Well, I guess two thoughts and let you react to them. One is, if you do raise the taxes on the top 1%, you're going to change the pre-tax income of the top 1%, not just the post-tax income. So there's sort of a assumption, I think, of all parties often that, we'll just take this money and give it to these folks, and then pre-tax income will be more equal. Well, it won't be, because you're playing with the returns in the labor market, and supply and demand are going to push the pre-tax compensation of those folks up partially to compensate for their lost income in the form of taxes. So, in fact, what you're going to do is often make what appears to be the gap between rich and poor actually bigger. If you tax the top 1% or the top 25% or whatever it is, you're actually going to raise their pre-tax income through economic forces, market forces, and it's going to look like you've made it worse. Your post-tax is going to be closer together, but your pre-tax is going to be bigger. The second thought I have is that 50 and 60 years you're talking about of transfer income, and I thought you were going to allude to this earlier, that affects your market income. Obviously, our ability and generosity through the political system of making it easier for people to get by with less work makes it easier for people to work less. And so you can't look at them independently. You can debate how big those effects are, the disincentives to work, and from transfer programs and implicit high marginal tax rates of those programs. But you can't just look at the market system's distribution of wages based on skill independently of that transfer system, because it affects it.
Well, of course, that's exactly right. And that comes to the major problem of all evaluators of policy. What's the counterfactual? That is, what would things really have looked like if you hadn't done the policy? And that goes back to this 1929 comparison that I was talking about. In 1929, people over the age of 65 had far more market income than they do today. That's not because they can't work. It's because they don't have to work, because we have these transfer systems that have allowed people to not work after the age of 62.
And
naturally,
if they do work, they lose some of those benefits, so they're discouraged from working. It's not just that they're comfortable.
That's right. That's right. So, and actually, a wonderful example of that is that the one group whose market income has dramatically increased since 1996 are single mothers. Well, why has their market income increased so much? It's increased so much because we went from an AFDC program, which completely discouraged work, to the new TANF program, which says that if you're a single mom, we will allow you to get benefits, but only for 5 years. But if you work, we will, even if it's in a low wage job, we'll provide you with earned income tax credits, which will supplement and subsidize work rather than leisure. So in that sense, if all you want to do is increase market income, I suppose you could stop providing all transfers, and then we'd have a lot more market income. But do we really want to do that?
It's a question for another time. My guest today has been Richard Burkhauser. Rich, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Happy to do it.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.